Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I'm Christy. I'm a former educator and hair colorist for Schwarzkopf, and in today's video I want to talk all about gray hair, why it happens, who it can happen to, and most importantly, how to cover it. So if you're a hair professional or you're just trying to cover your gray hair at home, this video can come in very handy. So let's get started. To know how to cover gray hair and to achieve predictable results, we really have to understand what is happening in the hair to make it turn gray. And what actually happens is, as we know, our hair grows out of hair follicles. Each follicle has a little sac with melanocytes which produce melanin, which is our natural hair pigmentation. It's what makes the hair the color that it is. But at a certain time, the hair actually stops, that follicle stops producing melanin, and our hair starts to grow out white or gray. So it's actually colorless. It doesn't have pigmentation. And that's why our hair is gray. Let's talk about certain things that are true about gray hair. Gray hair can happen to anybody. It can happen to people who are aging or older. That's usually who we relate gray or white hair to older people. But it can also happen to young people. It can even happen to kids, although it's not that common. But it can happen to anybody at any age. Another thing that is true about gray hair is that it can come as a result of health issues, stress, a medication. Think about presidents. When they start their term, they're not gray. By the time they're done, they're totally gray. Someone close to me once had to go through chemotherapy, and when her hair grew back, it grew back very gray and a totally different texture. And it was a challenge, and I think it was one of the things that motivated me to be a hair color specialist, because I had to get it right. Another thing that is true about gray hair is that when gray hair grows, it's not as strong and healthy looking. It may even look dry and porous compared to hair that has grown out with its natural pigments, natural pigmented hair. So if we put like one next to the other, like gray hair versus pigmented hair, gray hair is more resistant to color, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is stronger and healthier. And this is happening because, as I said before, when the gray hair is growing out of the follicle, it's also producing less oil, which is what makes the hair look healthy and shiny. And so it does look drier and it is more porous. And in a second, we're gonna see how that affects the results of our hair color when we're dyeing the gray hair. Also, it's growing out with a cuticle that is not as big and strong. It's like thin compared to a cuticle of a pigmented hair that is growing. So those are reasons that the hair that's gray tends to seem different than the other hair that's on our head. And another thing that's true about gray hair, and this is not something that you're imagining, is that gray hair does grow faster than hair that is pigmented. For some reason, that's just a fact. So like if you're like me, like all of a sudden I'm looking in the mirror and I know I'm aging. It's not that I don't know it, but all of a sudden I look in the mirror and I have all this gray hair and I'm like, oh, so that's what we're doing now. So now that we have those facts, let's focus on how we approach gray hair. What are the first things that we have to focus on? The first thing that you want to look at is how much gray hair is this? And we're going to talk in percentages. Do you have 0% of gray hair, 30% gray hair, 50% gray hair, more than 50, 60, 70, maybe 100% gray hair? That's going to be a determining factor as we formulate or buy a hair dye that's going to cover our gray hair. That's simple. And just to understand it better, let's just say 0 to 30%, 30% to 50%, which is like a medium amount of gray hair. And then you have 50 to 100%, which I would consider a high percentage of gray. Another thing that's important when you're coloring gray hair is to focus on what texture is the hair. And some people may think, oh, the texture, is it straight hair, is it curly hair? But that's not it. When we're talking about gray hair, we're referring to the texture as, is the hair strand a thin strand of hair? Is it a thick strand of hair? Is it a normal strand of hair? So we're talking about the diameter of each strand of hair. This is important because we all know that a hair strand has 3 components to it. It has a cuticle, which is on the outside. It has the cortex that has the characteristics of our hair, like the color that we have naturally, or if we dye it, that all happens in the cortex. And it has a medulla, which is not important for this subject right now. But in the hair cortex is where we develop color. And if we have a thin strand of hair, there's less room to apply pigmentation, for pigmentation to process in there. If we have a thick strand of hair or a coarse strand of hair, you have a lot of room inside that cortex. So you have a lot of room to put more pigmentation. And if you put less, you may have a different result than you expected. Now, a normal strand of hair is the way you would apply your formula or your hair dye, and you won't have to adjust your formula in any way because it should process exactly the way you intended it to. I hope that makes sense. And in a moment, I'm going to come back to this, and you're going to see how all these factors that we're talking about, hair texture, percentage of gray, how they all play a role when you're formulating to cover gray. So now let's look at the options that we have to actually cover gray hair. And there are many options when you're looking at different swatches of color that you can choose from to color your hair. But the go-to move for most hair colorists is to remain in the world of neutral colors. Those natural colors, the colors that you see on a dye box that say -0 or -N, or you may even see a -00 or a -NN, and some other colors that may cover 100% gray are ash colors or beige colors. It depends on the hair brand, the hair coloring brand that you're using, but basically that's it. We all refer back to those natural colors. So why do we go back to the natural series or the 0 series of hair dye? It's because that series has the perfect amount of primary hair color. I'm just talking about like the yellow, the red, and the blue. Those are the colors that we can't mix with any color to get. And when our hair naturally grows in gray, it's lacking those 3 primary colors. So it would make sense to use the natural series of a hair dye because it has the perfect amount of those 3 primary colors, and that's what we have to deposit back into the hair strand to make it look like it has some kind of pigment and it doesn't look off in any way. Because if you think about it and you apply a red hair dye to a hair that's colorless, it almost seems like it has nothing to grip to, and it may look like a translucent pinkish red. And that's not probably what you were going for. You wanted a natural red hair color. That makes sense, right? So that's how come we refer to that natural series. But then sometimes you see the -00 or NN, whichever the hair brand is using. It could be a numerical system or by letters. But that only means that it has more pigment than the one that just has 1 0 or 1 letter. In the brand that I use the most, which is Schwarzkopf, it means that you have 25% more color than in a regular hair dye that only has 1 number or letter after the dash. And if we just remember a second back when I talked about hair texture, if you think about that thick hair texture that I said that the diameter is bigger inside the cortex where you formulate your color, well then it would make sense to think that you need to use that hair series that has double pigmentation or 25% more pigmentation to fill up that cortex with enough hair dye pigments for it to look like it's beautifully colored and not look translucent or that it's lacking something. On the other hand, if you use that 00 on a fine hair strand, it may look like the color resulted too dark, dull, or maybe even flat. And you may have to adjust, I mean, you could do it, but you have to adjust your formula. And we're going to get to that in just a second as well. So now let's talk about peroxides or developers, whatever you want to call it. Now we're going to start putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. So basically, in basic hair color theory, I did a video on this where I explained it very well. I'll link it here. But we have 4 options of peroxide. We have 10%, 20%, 30%, and 40%. 10% is to deposit color or make your hair look darker. 20% you could lift 1 to 1.5 levels. 30%, you could lift 3 levels, 2.5 to 3 levels. 40%, you could go like 3.5, maybe even 4 levels of lift in the hair. But when it comes to covering gray, you want to keep yourself in the world of the 20% and the 30% developer. So now let's consider if a person has 100% gray. It's a whole different story, right? Because you don't have to lift any levels. Obviously, there's no levels to lift because you're as white as you can be. So I would always consider depositing, right? And I would go with the 20% volume just to have enough bubbles in there to distribute the hair dye where it has to go. And I wouldn't really be considering if the hair is fine, medium, or thick. I would go with the 20% because I need to deposit color in the hair. So when we're talking about coloring hair and peroxides or developers, the first thing that I relate that to is how long am I going to let it process? Because it doesn't depend on the hair color that you chose, what's in the box. The processing time depends on the developer that you chose. So if you had no gray and your hair was just normal hair, you would just follow the regular color theory. Whereas if you use a 10-20% developer, you're going to leave that process 30 minutes. If you use 30% or 40% developer, you're going to let that process 45 minutes. But this changes a little bit when it comes to gray hair. I usually like to leave the hair dye processing on the hair 45 minutes, independently if I'm using a 20% volume or a 30% volume, or if I'm even just depositing the color with a 10%, I'll always leave it on 45 minutes. Rule of thumb, you want the hair dye to stay on the hair that's gray the longest. So if you're doing an application and you're applying your hair dye to your hair or to anybody else, and you start where you have gray hair, you're going to start there, you're going to work your way back, and you start timing the hair dyeing process after you finish the last section. So those 45 minutes start to count as soon as you finish applying your hair dye to the last part of your hair. So now this brings me to the application of the hair dye to your hair. And like I just said, you're going to start applying obviously where you have the gray first. That's where you're going to apply your hair dye first. But you want to section your hair into quadrants, and you want to section each piece that you take in little sections. You don't want a part too big of a section, like a ½ inch is too big. You want it to be thin enough so when you apply the product to your hair and then you slice it again and part it and start the next section, you want to be able to see a little bit of that hair, the cream itself, the hair dye on the other side. You want to be able to see it. If you can't see it, you parted too big. And this is going to make sure that you don't miss any places, any spots on the hair. And it's also going to keep your sectioning clean so you can actually see what you're doing. And you start where you have the gray first. If it's where you part your hair or on the temples, start there and then start working your way back and start processing, like I said, when you finish the application. Hair dye has come such a long way, and they have made it so much easier to cover gray, whereas some brands have in the tube of hair dye itself, they already did the hard part for you, whereas they chose the permanent natural hair series with maybe the fashion color that you wanted. Another option that you have is the Igora Color 10. It's like an express color. It's my favorite series of the whole line of Schwarzkopf. It's the one that I use on myself the majority of the times because I can actually cover my gray or bring myself to any color in 10 minutes. So instead of waiting those 45 minutes, I can just do it in 10, and I will dedicate a whole video on this Express Igora 10 because I think it is so useful when you're doing it on yourself and you don't have that much time. And if you're in a salon, you can get people in and out to cover their gray during their lunch break, basically. It's gonna take you 10 minutes to 15 minutes to process it, and you can't take more than 10 minutes to apply it. That's the only downside, but it covers gray beautifully. That's the exception to the rule of the timing of the developers. Now let's say after you formulated perfectly and you covered the gray hair completely and the hair looks beautiful, it fades quickly. Why would this happen? If you remember at the beginning of the video, I was talking about certain things that are true about gray hair, and I said that gray hair grows out with a cuticle that is not as thick or strong as hair that is pigmented. That's the same reason why the color fades. When we talk about porosity of the hair, that means how quickly can a hair absorb some moisture or hair dye, and it also refers to how quickly it's gonna let that hair dye go. It's almost like if you didn't close a door completely or a window completely and the air conditioner is going throughout the window. That's the same thing with the hair. If that cuticle is not closed completely, the hair dye is gonna travel out of the hair. And that's why the color fades. Because it's not that you actually did anything wrong, it's just that that cuticle is not very strong and it's porous, making your color fade faster. So what are the solutions to this? First of all, you want to keep your hair as healthy as you can. Not use water that's too hot, and not use too many hot tools and things like that. Using a good shampoo and conditioner that will protect the color of your hair. But when you're in a salon, or maybe even if you're doing it to yourself, you usually have the options of toners in the same color of the hair dye that you chose. And this is a perfect easy fix. So let's set an example. Let's say you chose 6 gold and you mixed it perfectly with the natural and the gold series, and it covered perfectly but it faded. You can actually choose a hair toner in that same gold color, or even mix it with the natural and a gold, however you prefer. It's not going to make much of a difference, but when you can apply it to your hair. If you're in a salon, just do it after you shampoo the hair dye out. Before you actually start drying the hair, apply that toner from roots to ends, and you'll have like an extra barrier on that cuticle that's kind of gonna seal it, and it's gonna protect that color from coming out. Which usually, if you're dyeing your hair, you don't apply the color during the application. When you apply it to your roots, you usually don't overlap it and bring it down to the rest of your hair for many reasons. It could be because you maybe highlight the rest of your hair and you don't want to cover those highlights with the hair dye that you used on your roots. And if you're coloring your hair just one color, you don't want to always bring that hair dye down to the ends, because why do you have to do that? Like, your hair already has the color, and if the more ammonia and processing that you apply to a hair strand, it's not healthy. It's going to make it dry out eventually. So what you tend to do is just apply that color to your regrowth, and then from the mid lengths down to the ends, you would apply the toner on the same color of the regrowth, and have beautiful shiny hair, protecting it, because we all know that toners basically just coat the hair and make it look beautiful and shiny. But instead of doing that, what you can do is wait until the hair finishes processing and apply the toner from roots to ends, and you'll have your cuticle sealed, shiny, and the color won't fade as fast. You could also use this as something that you could do in between appointments. If you colored your hair on the 1st, and you know you have to go back on the 30th of the month, let's say 2 weeks later on the 14th, you decide, okay, I'm going to just cover my hair with the toner, cover whatever has grown out with the toner, and protect the color that is there. So if it faded, you can cover that fading. It's very easy, and it makes the hair look super beautiful, and depending on the ingredients that toner has, it'll make your hair healthier as well. In summary, I told you why gray hair happens. I told you about texture, about the percentage of gray, about the peroxides, how to mix them together, what colors to choose. We talked about different options that you may have if you want to get, like in Schwarzkopf, the absolutes where it's mixed for you, or if you want to do it in 10 minutes, which is like the best option ever. But I want to give you different case scenarios that you may be facing or that you see in a salon. So let's take for example, a person comes in and has a hair level 5, and that person has 20% of gray, and the person wants to be a 6 ash. Well, that's easy because she doesn't have that much gray, and I should be able to formulate normally. Her hair texture, let's say her hair texture is normal. This is like the perfect case scenario. Basically, I'm just lifting one level, so I know I can do that with the peroxide 20. I also know the peroxide 20 will cover gray, but that 20% gray isn't really gonna make a difference in the way the color looks. But let's say I wanna be very careful with it. So yeah, I can formulate with a natural base and then just use an ash. And to keep it simple, let's say do 50-50, equal parts. All companies have different instructions on how to use their products. So let's say you're using Wella. Wella says, well, if you have 20% of gray, well, then you're only gonna use 20% of that natural series, and then the remaining 80% is gonna be of that gold series that you chose. And that would make sense. You need less natural because you have less gray. So you don't have to return those yellow, blues, and reds that we talked about before. You don't need that much of that in the hair because there's not that much gray. But as a rule of thumb, some companies will say just do equal parts. So it all depends on the brand that you're using. So in this first case scenario, when we're lifting levels where the person doesn't have that much gray, we also have to work with those underlying pigments that we see when we're lifting levels in hair. It's just basic color theory. And I know that if I go from a level 5 to a level 6, I'm gonna see orange. And it's what we mostly see when we're lifting levels, and it's what it's most difficult to work with. And it really makes us think about how we're gonna formulate. So, but since she chose an ash color, I know the ash has blue in it, and it's going to neutralize that orange that I'm gonna see when I lift. So it all works out great. But now if we go to a second case scenario and we say, okay, that same level 5 and that same desired color is a 6 ash, but this time the person has 60% of gray and has thick, coarse hair, my formulation is completely gonna change because of that. So if we think about what I talked about before, you would actually choose, yes, you're gonna choose that level 6, and you're gonna think about that she has a lot of room in that cortex because she has a thick texture to her hair. So that means I'm not going to use the regular natural series with only 1 0. I'm going to use the one with double 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use equal parts of 600 and 6 ash, and I'll use a volume 20 developer because not only because we're only lifting one level of hair, but because that hair strand is coarse, it's large, it's thick, and I need a lot of pigmentation inside of there. And I'll let it process for 45 minutes. Now let's take one more example. That same case. Person comes in, natural level 5, wants to be the same target color, a 6 ash, but this person now has 70% of gray, which is a lot of gray, and she has very thin hair. Geez, what do you do, right? Because if you think about it, when you're going from a level 5 to a level 6, you would ordinarily choose a peroxide volume 20. Keep that in mind because I think this is where sometimes our formulations may go wrong. She wants to go and be a 6A, so I am going to choose a 6 natural, a 6-0, and the 6-ash, or 1 if it were Schwarzkopf. And I'm going to mix them equal parts. But she has 70% of gray, and I would like to use a double 0-0, but since that hair is fine, I know that it may look too dark, but I'm going to choose the 6-0 and the 6-A. And I'm going to use, instead of volume 20, if you think about it, that's what you would use, you're only lifting one level. I'm going to use a volume 30 because that's a lot of pigment to put into that hair strand, and it's going to look too dark and dull and flat. So I have to go with that volume 30 peroxide. So those are all just some basic examples of how all the information that I explained all play a role when we're formulating to cover gray hair. So if you have any questions or comments, just leave them in the section below. And that's all I have for you today. So until the next time, bye.